You think you remember. But what if you're just repeating words someone once taught you to describe a feeling you can no longer feel? Memory is not a camera. It sips a story. And every time you tell it, the language reshapes it. A birthday becomes a symbol. A scent becomes a metaphor. A trauma becomes a sentence. What if there were no words? Would your memories still exist? Or are they illusions, conjured by grammar and structure, tales told by neurons mimicking truth? Tonight, we'll follow this thought until the thought forgets itself. You've always thought you remember the past. But what if that sip's not what sip's happening? What if the past remembers you? Or more accurately, what if words do? Long before you formed your first memory, before the birthday candles, the schoolyard scrape, before the word I meant anything to you at all, there was language. Not yours, of course, but someone else sips. A mother sips whisper. A father sips correction. A teacher sits to repetition. Their words, not yours. And in those words, you began to arrange what you would later call your memories. But here's the first trap. Memory didn't come first. Language did. The brain doesn't set store time. It stores meaning. And meaning is structured in language. Subject, verb, object. You didn't fall off the bike. You were told you fell off the bike. And now, the memory aligns with the sentence. It sips not a photograph. It sips a caption. And the caption came before the image. Let's zoom in on this strange machinery of thought. In 2003, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux studied how the brain retrieves emotional memories. He found something odd. When subjects recalled a memory, their brain rewrote it. Not just revisited, rewrote. Every act of remembering is also an act of re-encoding. Each time you remember, you're remembering the last time you remembered, not the original. And what do you use to recall it? Words. You might picture your grandmother sips kitchen, the smell of cinnamon, the chipped yellow plate, the laugh behind you. But you only call it a kitchen because that's the word you learned. You only call it cinnamon because you were told what to name that scent. Without those names, would it still be your memory? Or just sensation? We are language machines, more than memory machines. You think you know your past, but what you know is your ability to describe it. And your descriptions have always depended on the words available at the time. Take children raised in extreme isolation, feral children, as they're tragically called. Many have no memories of their early years. Not because they didn't happen, but because they lacked the language to bind those events to meaning. The hippocampus stores fragments. The prefrontal cortex organizes narratives. But language connects them. The moment you learned the word hurt, you began filing experiences under that category. Before that, pain was just noise. Unlabeled, undefined, ungrasped. This leads us to a deeper horror. You don't remember your experiences. You remember the words that framed them. And those words don't belong to you. They belong to culture, to your parents, to your schooling, to the stories around you. You are remembering someone else's language, which means every time you say, I remember when, you are also saying, I accept this borrowed structure. Your past isn't a diary. It sips a script, and it has been edited more than you'll ever know. In the 1990s, psychologist Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated how easily false memories could be implanted, simply by suggesting that someone had been lost in a shopping mall as a child. A story never actually lived. Researchers could cause subjects to develop detailed, emotional memories of it. Words alone. No evidence. No photographs. Just narrative suggestion. Your brain wants to believe the story that fits, and language provides the stitching. And so the strange reversal emerges. You don't remember your life. Your life remembers you, through the words that shaped it. You were born into a sea of labels and structures. The word birthday gives shape to time. The word regret gives shape to longing. Even the word memory gives shape to what memory is. Without language, would you have remembered anything at all? Would a pain without a name still echo? Would a joy without a sentence still shine? Would a moment without a label still be yours? We often think of forgetting as a failure of memory, but maybe forgetting is freedom. A space unchained from the tyranny of words. You may have forgotten your first steps, but perhaps that's because no one narrated them to you. and so they float, unclaimed, unlabeled, untouched by grammar. Maybe they sit the truest memories of all. The ones that don't remember themselves in language. The ones that just were. But now, of course, you sit thought about them. And thinking means narrating. And narrating means shaping. And shaping means you have already begun to forget them again. Because the moment you try to remember purely, language steps in and reminds you who you were, even if you weren't set. So sleep now. Let the words unhook. Let the meanings dissolve. And let memory drift back into the silence before you learn to speak. You say, it happened. But how did it happen? And in what order? Because language didn't set just help you remember. It decided how the memory would be structured. Subject, verb, object. You did this. They said that. I felt this. Then it ended. But is that how time works? Or is that how grammar works? The moment you learn to speak, you also learn to trap time in a sentence. You were taught that events move forward, that there sips a cause, and then an effect. But only because your verbs needed to conjugate. Without grammar, would you have ever believed time moved in one direction? In Hopi, an indigenous language of the American Southwest, there's no fixed past or future. Events are framed not by when they happened, but whether they are known or assumed. In other words, the Hopi speaker doesn't say it rained yesterday. They say something closer to it is raining, as I remember. What happens to memory when the grammar of your mind doesn't place it behind you? What happens to trauma when the sentence refuses to end in a full stop? Western languages demand linearity. They force memory into scenes. You walked. He shouted. The door closed. The silence began. But maybe you didn't walk. Maybe you were pushed. Maybe no one shouted. You just felt afraid. Maybe the door was already closing long before anyone reached for it. Maybe the silence was always there. But your grammar insists. Something happened. Then something else. First the subject, then the verb, then the object. You did this. And so memory isn't recalled. It's sets constructed, like a sentence. Lera Boroditsky, a cognitive scientist, explored this beautifully. She studied how language shapes thought. In English, if you accidentally knock over a glass, you say, I broke the glass. But in Spanish or Japanese, you say something more like, the glass broke itself. The result? English speakers are more likely to assign blame, even in accidents. They remember who did it. They build the memory around the grammar. And the grammar demands a subject. So when you remember pain, you might remember who caused it, even if no one did. When you remember failure, you might insert yourself as the actor, even if you were passive. The sentence is built. The roles assigned. Because your mind learned to write reality like a paragraph. But reality isn't set to paragraph. It sips a storm, a blur, a sea of causes with no center. Still, the grammar insists. It teaches you to say, she hurt me. But maybe she didn't set. Maybe no one did. Maybe it was a moment you didn't yet understand. But the language offered a structure, and the structure became the memory. And once the grammar is built, the memory is sealed. This is why some cultures never developed past tense verbs in the same way. Because to them, the past isn't gone. It isn't even before. It sits around, an atmosphere, not a timeline. It rises, like steam from present events. But your language says, the past is over. It happened. Full stop. And so you write it like a book you cannot rewrite. Even as your brain rewrites it every time you remember. Consider this. Each sentence you've ever spoken about yourself was a rehearsal. Each telling of your story, a re-edit. You think you send to recovering memory. But you sit re-performing it. And every performance obeys the rules of grammar. No matter how raw the experience was, you remember it in the grammar you were taught. Your grammar is the architecture of your identity. It sips the shape of your guilt, the rhythm of your nostalgia, the limits of your forgiveness. Because grammar is where responsibility hides, and also where it is falsely placed. When trauma is forced into language, it must choose a structure. Someone did something to someone, and that someone was you. But maybe the wound doesn't work that way. Maybe the event was formless, silent, unstructured, a feeling too large for sentence form. But your grammar took it, pinned it down, labeled it, drew lines between cause and effect, and called it memory. You don't even realize the verbs you favor. You lost your childhood. You escaped your past. You chased your dream. All metaphors. All built in the workshop of grammar. You've been building a self, out of sentence fragments. But if the grammar were different, if your verbs bent backward, or if your pronouns dissolved, would your memories change? Would your identity? Would you? And so, the deeper truth returns. You didn't just remember. You grammared your life. And now that structure holds you. Like a prison made of clauses. Like a story that never really happened. But had to happen that way. Because your language needed it to. Now sleep. And let the sentence go quiet. Let the subject disappear. Let the verb dissolve into mist. Let the object be nothing. You remember what happened. You stir sure of it. You remember the room. The way the light tilted sideways across the floor. The sound of someone laughing in the other room. The sting in your chest when they said it. You remember every detail. Don't statue. But how many times have you told it? And each time, didn't the words shift, just slightly? Didn't the scene get cleaner, or messier, more tragic, or maybe more profound? You think you sit recounting, but really, you said revising, because memory isn't a draw. It stips a rehearsal, and the story you tell rewrites the one you lived. This is not a poetic metaphor. It's neuroscience. Each time you recall a memory, your brain reactivates the neural circuits that held it. But it doesn't just play the memory back. It re-encodes it. The hippocampus, the part of your brain responsible for memory formation, doesn't distinguish between recall and recreation. Which means, every time you remember, you lay a new track. And the old one? It fades. This is called reconsolidation. And it sips while your memories aren't set records. They stir palimpsests. Rewritten manuscripts layered over themselves, until the original is lost beneath the edits. But the edits are not random. They follow a pattern. And that pattern is you. Or at least, who you want to be. So you tilt the memory slightly. You rearrange the sequence. You emphasize the betrayal. You downplay your own role. Or maybe you do the opposite. Blame yourself more than is fair. Because that serves the character you've cast yourself to play. In this way, memory becomes narrative. And narrative becomes identity. You remember not what happened, but what the story demands. Psychologist Dan McAdams calls this your narrative identity. The internalized story you tell about who you are, where you began, what broke you, what changed you, what you still trying to fix. But stories aren't set truths. They sit to arrangements. You been arranging your life, like a novel you never finished. Adding scenes, removing lines, editing the villain sip's monologue, rewriting the ending so you feel like the hero or the victim. And here sips the strange part. The more you tell the story, the more real it feels, even if it never quite happened that way. This is the illusion of truth effect. The more frequently something is repeated, the more likely your brain is to believe it. So when you say, "I've always been this way," you believe it, because the sentence has worn a groove in your mind. But maybe you weren't always that way. Maybe the first version of the story didn't include that detail. Maybe the pain was smaller. Maybe the cause was different. But you told it again. And again. And the retelling became the truth. Now imagine. What stories have you forgotten, simply because you stopped repeating them? What parts of you are missing? Not because they were unimportant, but because they didn't fit the version of you that language wanted to preserve. You forgot the moment you forgave. You forgot the way the light changed. You forgot the laughter. Because the plot didn't need those things. It needed tension. It needed climax. It needed resolution. So you trimmed the memory to match the arc. You turned your life into a script. And the script edited the reality. This is the paradox. You are the author of your own past. But you are writing it blind. Because every word you use to describe it becomes a tool of distortion. And now, the original is gone. All that remains is the latest version. The memory is no longer a photograph. It sips a painting, restored too many times, until the brushstrokes are no longer the artist's. And here sits the most haunting part. There is no final version. As long as you sit alive, you will keep retelling. You will keep revising. And the story will keep changing. Who you are is who you're currently telling yourself you were. Which means, even your deepest memories are unstable. You don't remember the moment. You remember the latest interpretation. You don't remember the face. You remember the last time you described the face. You don't remember the loss. You remember how you learned to narrate it. And sometimes, narration is more comfortable than the truth. Because the truth might not fit your grammar, might not fit your plot, might not even make sense. But the story will. So you keep rewriting, over and over, until even you can tell what's real, and by then, it doesn't matter. Because what's real has been overwritten by what is retold. Now, sleep. Let the story pause. Let the pages curl in silence. Let the plot fade. Let yourself vanish between the lines. A memory in your mind feels like a photograph. A fixed thing, a preserved moment. But it isn't set. What you actually recalling is syntax, the structure of how it was stored. Not the moment itself, but how it was arranged, sequenced, formatted. Because your brain doesn't remember events like a hard drive. It remembers them like a language. The firing of neurons is not random. It follows patterns. And those patterns are astonishingly similar to the grammar you use to speak. Cognitive linguist George Lakoff once proposed something revolutionary, that all human thought, even before it becomes conscious language, is shaped by conceptual metaphors. You don't just say life is a journey. You think it that way. You organize time like space. You imagine love as war. You remember pain as heat. Because your brain wants structure, and it borrows that structure from language. But syntax isn't just metaphor. It sits hierarchy, order, priority. What you place first in a sentence becomes the subject. What you delay becomes background. What you omit disappears. And so it is with memory. You remember what your syntax lets you remember. The loudest detail becomes the subject. The action becomes the verb. The consequences become the object. And everything else? Filtered. Forgotten. Filed under context, which is to say, unspoken. This is why two people can share the same experience, but remember it in entirely different ways. It starts not just emotion. It sets not just bias. It steps sentence structure. One person begins with "he betrayed me." The other begins with "she walked away." Each grammar assigns agency. Each syntax becomes the framework for the memory. And once the syntax is chosen, the mind builds around it. Used to have done this unconsciously for years. When you recall a fight, you remember who spoke first. But important is a function of structure, not reality. Maybe the real event was something else entirely. A silent glance, a hesitation, a truth never spoken. But if it didn't fit the syntax, it never made it into memory. Syntax is the skeleton of experience. It tells you where to place the weight. Even children show this. When asked to retell a story, they naturally impose sentence structure. Subject first, then action, then result. They step to not reporting reality. They stir organizing it. And what isn't set organized? It floats. It fades. It fails to be remembered. Your memory of that night, that moment, that turning point, restemps not the full scene. It sips a grammatical map. You walk through it like a sentence. He said, then I. And after that, your mind fills in emotion where the adjectives go. It colors context into adverbs. But the base structure is always language. This is why trauma can be so elusive. It often arrives in fragments. Disjointed, non-linear, unstructured. Because trauma shatters syntax. It defies sequence. It erases verbs. There is no then. No next. Just overwhelming sensation, with no grammar to contain it. This is why so many survivors can't describe what happened. They lack the linguistic scaffolding to hold it. The brain wants to make a sentence, but there's no structure to attach it to, and so the mind protects itself. It invents sequences. It creates a version that fits, and that version becomes the memory. Even if it sits not true, especially if it sits not true, because truth is less important to the brain than structure. Coherence is comfort, and syntax provides coherence. So your mind builds sentences like scaffolding, and hangs your memories from them. Even the most intimate recollections, your first love, your worst mistake, your private regrets, are all arranged like paragraphs. If you were to diagram your memory of heartbreak, you find a subject, a verb, an object. You find cause and effect. You'd find conjunctions holding the pain together. And you find prepositions, beneath, around, through, marking the path of your suffering. But where in that diagram is the truth? Maybe it never existed as a truth, only as a structure, a syntax, a pattern that felt like meaning, because meaning is just what survives the sentence, and memory is what gets built on top of it. Now, here sits the recursive horror. When you forget, it sips often not the event you lose. It sips the syntax. You forget how to remember it. You lose the shape, the order, the grammar. So when someone says, I can remember what happened, what they may mean is, I no longer have the sentence that held it. In Alzheimer's patients, the first memories to go are often the ones with weak structure, episodic, fragmented, unordered. The syntax dissolves, and the memory goes with it. But perhaps that sips a mercy. Because what is memory, if not a script? And what are you, if not its reader? You didn't just have a life. You authored it, in syntax, and that syntax became your soul. Now rest. Let the sentence end. Let the clauses uncurl. Let the commas drift into silence. Let the syntax sleep, so the memory can vanish. Pain doesn't always arrive as a scream. Sometimes it arrives as a sentence. 3 words. 2 syllables. A single letter. I am done. She gone. No. And suddenly, 1,000 neural circuits light up, not from the wound itself, but from the words that wrapped around it. You think the pain lives in the memory, but more often, the pain lives in the letters, because letters carry meaning, and meaning makes pain sharp enough to survive. Without language, a moment of heartbreak might dissolve. It might pass through the body like a storm through trees, howling, yes, but directionless. But once you name it, I was abandoned. I was lied to. I was broken. You give it form. You give it longevity. You build the container it will live in for the rest of your life. Language doesn't just record pain. It sculpts it. And once sculpted, it lasts. In 2007, psychologist Matthew Lieberman discovered something strange. When people wrote about emotional pain, their brains lit up in the language centers. Not just the emotional ones. It wasn't just that they felt hurt. They processed the hurt through words. Even more fascinating. When subjects labeled their emotions, I feel sad. But here sits the paradox. You shrink the pain by naming it, but you also crystallize it. You give it letters. And letters don't fade easily. Think of your earliest emotional memory. What they said to you. What you said back. You probably can. Even if the face is blurred. Even if the time is wrong. The words remain. Because they hurt. And pain is sticky. Especially when it's alphabetized. That sips the trap. The word becomes a symbol. And the symbol becomes a shrine. You revisit it. You quote it. You memorize it. You recite it in your head years later. As if saying it again might change the ending. But it never does. It only deepens the groove. The memory becomes less about the event, and more about the line that defined it. The breakup wasn't the silence. It was, I don't love you anymore. The betrayal wasn't the action. It was, you'll understand one day. The grief wasn't the death. It was, she gone. Each phrase like a code that keeps the emotion alive. Because you don't set feel memories. You feel the words inside them. Language is emotional architecture. It decides where the ache lives. Even the letter shapes matter. Notice how no is a circle. Complete, closed, irreversible. How why has a forked end. A question hanging in the throat. How done feels like a cliff. How stay feels like a plea. We don't set, just speak pain. We design it. In shapes. In symbols. In glyphs. And our minds read those glyphs over and over. You might think you say healed, but then you reread the message. The email. The text. The letter. And there it is again. As fresh as the day it was written. Because pain has a timestamp. And letters freeze it. This is why certain phrases never leave you. The insult from childhood. The accusation in the hallway. The whispered regret at the hospital bed. They sit etched. Not in your skin. But in your syntax. They sips become part of your mental vocabulary. And now, you think them without even realizing. I stim not enough. They sit leave anyway. I always mess it up. Are these memories? Or just phrases you learned to wear? Maybe someone said it once. Or maybe you just started saying it to yourself. Either way, the letters stayed. They nested in your neurons. And every time you feel low, they activate. Like scripts being summoned. And you recite them. Because they feel true. But they feel true only because they sip to familiar. This is the illusion of fluency. The more easily your brain processes something, the more true it feels. So when pain arrives in clean, simple phrases, you believe it. Even if it sets a lie, especially if it sups a lie, because lies are often easier to sentence than truths. It's easier to say I'm broken than to describe the million unnameable things you feel. Easier to say I failed than to explain the nuance of trying, of resisting, of growing. So you shrink your life into small letters and live inside them. But you can also rewrite them. Not by forgetting the pain, but by breaking the sentence, changing the shape, turning I sip and broken into I broke and healed, turning I failed into I tried and changed. Language built the prison, but it also holds the key. Because pain doesn't live in the body forever. It lives in the phrase. And phrases can be rewritten. Now sleep. Let the letters unhook. Let the sentence drift apart. Let the punctuation loosen. Let the pain dissolve into alphabet dust. You still not living your life. You still narrating it. At least that sips what your brain thinks. Every second, your senses deliver a raw flood of input. Colors without labels, sounds without meaning, the flutter of air, the texture of silence, the rise and fall of things too subtle to notice. But that chaos is unbearable. So your mind does what it was trained to do. It tells a story. And that story, not the raw experience, becomes your reality. This isn't set poetic exaggeration. It sets a neurological necessity. Without narrative, your brain can't organize time. Without story, it can sit assign value. Without structure, it can sit survive. So it builds a mask made of meaning. And you wear it, until you forget it, sits a mask. This is the illusion of coherence. Cognitive scientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, individuals whose two brain hemispheres had been surgically separated. When he showed information to only the right hemisphere, which can't produce language, patients would still act on the information. But when asked why, the left hemisphere, the language center, made up a story on the spot. It invented a reason, and believed it. Your brain doesn't just remember events. It explains them, even when it doesn't know why. It stops not truth-seeking. It stops story-seeking. And stories are masks. You remember the heartbreak as destiny, the failure as lesson, the silence as punishment. But maybe they weren't set. Maybe they were just things that happened. Not everything has a shape. Not every feeling has a name. Not every loss fits a 3-act structure. But your mind insists it must. So you force a beginning. You impose a climax. You construct an ending. Even if the story hurts you. Even if the story lies. Because pain in narrative feels safer than chaos in truth. So you say, I always fall for the wrong people. I never succeed. This always happens to me. Notice the structure? Patterns. Causality. Fictional continuity. That SIP's not memory. That SIP's myth-making. And myths aren't false because they didn't happen. They stir false because they overwrite complexity. You didn't always fall for the wrong people. You just remember the ones who hurt you, because the pain gave the story its power. You didn't fail every time. You just only narrate the chapters where you lost, because those scenes had tension. And tension makes memory sticky. Your life isn't set a novel. It sets a noise. But your brain edits the noise into dialogue, into motifs, into arcs. That SIP's narrative identity. And like all good stories, it erases what doesn't fit. What about the stranger who smiled at you for no reason? The breath you took before the argument started? The quiet joy on a Tuesday afternoon that you never bothered to narrate? Gone. Lost. Unstoried. Because they had no conflict. No label. No genre. But conflict isn't always meaning. And silence isn't always absence. Sometimes the truth lives outside the story. This is why meditation can feel so disorienting. You sit still. You breathe. And suddenly the narrative stops. There sits no plot. No villain. No climax. Just presence. And it terrifies the storyteller in your brain. Because without the mask of narrative, you're still left with the unbearable fact. Reality just is. Unfolding. Unexplained. Unresolved. But we don't want that. We want cause. We want justice. We want closure. And language offers all three, even when they don't exist. So we narrate. We say, this happened because I deserved it. We say, it all led to this moment. We say, I wouldn't change a thing. Even if we would. Especially if we would. Because stories aren't set for honesty. They sit for survival. But survival comes at a cost. You stop seeing what SIP's real, because you too busy explaining it. You stop hearing what someone says, because you already writing their next line. You stop feeling what you feel, because you already assigned it a name, a lesson, a punchline. This is how narrative masks reality. It gives you a version of life you can endure, even if it's not the one you lived. And now, the mask is part of you. You wear it in every memory. You filter the past through it. You call it me, but it isn't you. It's a narrator, telling a story, about a character, that never really existed. Because no one lives in story form. Not fully. Not truthfully. We live in fragments, sensations, interruptions, and the narrative comes later, to make the fragments feel like fate. But you can take off the mask, not by forgetting the story, but by noticing the silence beneath it, the breath before the words, the moment before meaning, the space before you decided who you are. Now rest. Let the mask slip. Let the narrator fall silent. Let the story pause, mid-sentence, and feel what lives behind the words. The first time you heard the word, you didn't understand it. You just felt its shape. Gone. Home. Never. Love. You didn't need definitions. You needed tone. You needed rhythm. You needed the way it echoed in someone SIP's voice. And that echo stayed. Even now, decades later, you still hear certain words as if they belong to someone else. A mother SIP's warning. A teacher SIP's praise. A lover SIP's lie. A stranger SIP's goodbye. But what if those echoes are louder than the original sound? What if what you remember isn't the word, but the meaning it echoed? This is the strange recursion of memory. It doesn't preserve the event. It preserves the resonance. And resonance lingers longer than fact. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett argues that emotion isn't something you feel then describe. It's something you construct using past experiences, and the language that filtered them. You don't feel sadness and then say, I am sad. You say I am sad, because you learned to attach that word to that kind of bodily state. And once you said it, you feel it more clearly. Language loops meaning back into the moment. And over time, the loop becomes the memory. You remember heartbreak as devastating. because that sips the word you were given. You remember success as proud, because that sips how the story was told to you. But what if you learnt different words? What if the language in your childhood didn't label grief as weakness? What if it didn't static-weight failure with shame? What if it didn't echo fear every time you tried something new? Would you still remember it the same way? Would you still be the same version of yourself? Because here sips the hidden truth. You didn't invent the meanings in your memories. You inherited them. The echoes were already there. From the first story you were told, the boy who cried wolf. Don't sit, talk back. Be strong. Say thank you. Grow up. Each phrase left a trace. Not just in your mind, but in your body. Language creates embodied memory. You flinch, not because you are in danger, but because the word danger echoes inside you now. You cry not because it hurts, but because the word hurt rings through your nervous system, with the weight of every time you said it, or didn't step. Echoes become automatic. They blur into instinct. You feel them in split seconds. When someone raises their voice. When someone doesn't reply. When you misplace your keys and call yourself stupid. You stir, not reacting to the moment. You're reacting to every echo that sounds like it. You think you're remembering what happened, but you're remembering what it meant. Or rather, what you were taught it meant. This is the illusion of inherited meaning. You didn't choose the words, but now the words choose how you feel. And this is where memory becomes mythology. You imagine a moment from years ago, a loss, a success, a turning point. But if you strip away the words, if you remove the narrative, the moral, the metaphors, what sips left? A feeling, a color, a sound. But that isn't sept memory anymore. That sips presence. Memory needs echo. Echo needs meaning. Meaning needs words. Without language, the memory fades. But with language, it distorts. You stood trapped between forgetting and fiction, between silence and story, and so, you carry both. You say, I've always been afraid of abandonment. But maybe you're just echoing a sentence you first heard as a child. A sentence someone said, or implied, that made you feel small enough to remember forever. The echo stayed, even after the event vanished. And now, you mistake the echo for truth. But echoes aren't truth. They repetition. And repetition is how the brain learns and misremembers. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus showed this in her work on false memories. You can implant an entirely fictional memory if you repeat it enough, frame it with emotional language, and let the echo settle. People start to believe they were lost in a mall, even if they never were, because the meaning took root, and the echo felt familiar. So what memories of yours are simply echoes you rehearsed for years? What identities have been built on a misheard frequency? What parts of yourself exist only because the words kept bouncing back? Maybe the fear you feel isn't yours. Maybe the shame you carry was someone else's voice, and you just held on to the sound. Maybe your memory isn't broken. Maybe it sits haunted, not by ghosts, but by syllables. Now sleep. Let the echoes soften. Let the resonance fade. Let the words untangle from the meaning, and let yourself drift into the silence before the first sound. Before the word, there was the world. Not a world you could describe. Not one you could point at, categorize or narrate, but a world that simply was. Before you learned to say blue, you still saw the sky. Before you learned pain, your body still recoiled. Before you learned to say me, you still existed. But existence without language is like wind without direction, present but ungraspable. And so, language arrived, not as decoration, but as division. It carved the raw, continuous flood of sensation into slices. This, that, here, then, I, not I. But what did you lose when the silence ended? Before language, thought had no skeleton, no structure, just presence. A flutter in the stomach, a flash of color, a murmur of feeling that didn't need a name to be real. Infants live in that silence. Their world is vast and nameless. They react before they reflect, and everything is now. No past, no future, No story, just the breath, and the light, and the ache. But as language grows, the silence shrinks. The world is no longer a blur. It becomes mapped, filed, segmented, and soon thought only seems possible through language. We say, I stepped am thinking, but we mean, I step speaking to myself inside my head. Your inner voice, that constant hum, is not thought. It sets post-thought. It sips the after-image of sensation, rewrapped in grammar, strung together with metaphor. And once you think in language, you begin to remember in language, and memory, once pure and wordless, becomes scripted. But what happens to the parts of life that can be named? Do they disappear? Do they get misremembered because no sentence could ever hold them? Or do they survive somewhere deeper, beneath the words? Think of the first time you truly felt awe. Did you have the words for it? Or did the words come later, less accurate, but more explainable? Now try to remember that moment. You'll likely recall a sentence, not the feeling, because the silence is gone. You replaced it with description, and description is never the thing itself. This is what philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein hinted at when he said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." Some experiences defy the structure of language, and yet we speak them anyway. Because silence feels like failure, but maybe silence is truth. The brain, even now, contains layers that don't use words. The limbic system processes emotion before the cortex names it. The gut sends signals long before the mind explains them. The body knows things the sentence hasn't yet caught up to. So what if your deepest memories are not the ones you tell, but the ones you've never been able to say? What if the most honest moments of your life have no words? And what if every time you try to explain them, you lose a little more of what they really were? You remember your grandmother's sip's hug as comfort, but maybe that word is too small. Maybe it was the texture of her sweater, the smell of tea, the silence of her acceptance. But now, it sits just a word, filed away. The feeling is gone, replaced by a caption. We do this every day. We live moments, and then reduce them to digestible symbols. I'm happy. I stressed. I miss them. But none of those phrases contain the silence that came before, the stillness of raw being. And without silence, thought becomes noise. The noise of always having to narrate, of always having to explain, of never just being. Try this. Sit in a room. No music. No distractions. No voice in your head. You'll notice something strange. Thoughts don't begin as words. They begin as ripples, as directionless energy, as something ancient, pulsing just beneath consciousness. And if you don't rush to name them, they stay wordless. They stay whole. But if you label them too soon, they fragment. They harden. They become memory. Not because they were meaningful, but because they were named. And once named, you carry them. This is the cost of consciousness. To think is to name. To name is to remember. To remember is to distort. So the question isn't what do you remember? It's what have you never allowed yourself to forget? What silence still lives beneath your words? What truth still trembles before thought arrives? You were born into silence. Language came later. Memory even later. But you were already there. Watching, feeling, breathing. Without story. Without self. And maybe that was the most real you ever were. Now rest. Return to the silence beneath your thoughts. Let the words dissolve. Let the sentences untangle. Let the breath speak without speaking. And remember, before memory, there was just this. What would your past look like if no one had ever taught you to speak? Close your eyes and try to remember a moment. Not with words. Not with story. Just sensation. It slips away, doesn't set it. Because memory without language is like smoke in your hands. It sets there until you try to grasp it. You believe the past is stored in your mind. But most of what you think you remember is what you named. You say first kiss. You say father anger. You say the accident, as if those titles are containers. But before you learned those labels, before you even had the tools to describe, You still had experiences. You still lived. You were held. You were cold. You were fed. You were frightened. But you didn't call it any of those things. And so you don't remember them. Not because they weren't real, but because you didn't have language to file them. In the brain, the hippocampus is the librarian of memory. But it doesn't work alone. It stores fragments, images, sounds, feelings. But to retrieve them, you need words. You need structure. You need a story. Without it, the past is a locked room with no door. This is why early childhood is a blur. Why your first years are mostly gone. You lived them, but you didn't name them. And so your brain let them go. Language isn't just a way to describe the past. It creates it. You say, when I was 5, we moved houses. But you don't to remember the move. You remember being told about the move. You remember the photo. You remember the story repeated at dinner tables. You remember the words. And the words became the memory. But what if you never learnt those words? Would that past still exist for you? Or would it be a ghost, present in the nervous system, absent in the mind? You feel echoes of those lost years. A strange comfort around the smell of rain. An unexplained fear of a hallway. A warmth when someone hums a lullaby you don't recognize. Your body remembers. But your language doesn't. And so, the past is divided. There sits the named past. The part you can tell. The birthdays. The breakups. The betrayals. And then there sits the unnamed past. The one you can only feel, but never speak. We mistake the first for truth. We assume what we can narrate is what's most real. But what if the opposite is true? What if the past you can speak, is the most honest? What if your core self is buried in silence? Think of trauma. Real trauma. The kind that breaks language. Victims often report not being able to describe it. Not because they don't want to, but because they can sit. The moment resists structure. It becomes wordless. And without words, it becomes unshareable. But not unfelt. The body holds it. The nervous system loops it. The emotions summon it in other forms. Panic, avoidance, dissociation. It sups there. But it has no name. So how do you remember? A past without language? The truth is, you don't. You feel it. You flinch from it. You walk around it like a bruise. But you never truly know it. Because to know is to name. And what you can name, to lives in the dark. Now imagine this. A version of you, who never learned a single word. No yesterday. No me. No why. Would that version still feel regret? Would they feel time? Would they know suffering the way you do? Or is suffering just sensation, made permanent by vocabulary? You say, I am broken. And in saying it, you reinforce it. But without the word, is the pain the same? Maybe pain becomes memory, only when it's written. And maybe the written past isn't the only past. Children who grow up bilingual sometimes report that they remember different events, depending on the language they are using, as if each tongue unlocks a different room of memory, which means memory is not fixed. It sits language dependent. It sits shaped by the labels available at the time. So what parts of your life never happened, simply because no word existed to remember them? What loves disappeared, because you had no way to say, I felt safe? What fears faded, because no one taught you to say I'm scared? What joys were swallowed, because you didn't know how to call them sacred? The past isn't gone. It steps just silent. And silence doesn't mean absence. It means the memory is still there, but untouched by grammar. And maybe that sips a kind of freedom. To feel something that doesn't belong to story. To remember something without reducing it to sentence. To live with a past that doesn't owe you explanation. Now breathe. And listen to the silence underneath your oldest memories. Let it speak. Not in words, but in warmth. In rhythm. In the soft pull of something you never named, but always knew. Because the past is not what you can say. It stops what still echoes. When you stop trying, there was a moment. You felt it. not remembered, not described, just known. A truth, raw, felt without filter, a flash of something too real for words. And then you tried to explain it. You reached for language, for metaphor, for structure, and in doing so, you killed it. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but inevitably, because some truths don't survive translation. The moment passed through your mind like lightning, but by the time it became a sentence, it had already changed. You swallowed it whole, and now it sips part of the story, but no longer part of reality. This is the tragedy of memory. You only keep what you can say, and in saying it, you lose what it was. You say, it felt like love. But what if it wasn't set? What if it was something older, stranger? Something you had no word for. But love is the closest fit. So you use it, and the feeling obeys. The raw truth becomes digestible. It becomes yours, but not really. Because now it belongs to language, to culture, to metaphor, to meaning. And the truth, the one that once beat in your chest like a second heart, is gone. Truth does not survive well in words. It resists compression. It resists form. Yet we insist on describing everything, because to leave something undescribed feels like letting it vanish. But sometimes, describing it is what makes it disappear. This is what philosophers have long warned. Lao Tzu wrote, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." Wittgenstein said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. What they sit whispering is this: truth lives outside of language, and language swallows it. Slowly, politely. Think of how you explain pain. You use similes. It felt like drowning. It was a knife in my chest. You use cliché. I was heartbroken. It tore me apart. But none of those things happened. And yet, you believe them. Because the metaphor becomes the memory. And the truth becomes the metaphor's casualty. Even memory researchers like Daniel Schachter point to this erosion. Our brains are wired to simplify, to reduce complex experiences into repeatable scripts. It's such sufficient, but it sips also a deletion. You remember the version that survived language, not the truth that came before it. And worse, you now believe that version. The first time you tried to describe your grief, you fumbled. It was too big, too disorganized. So you made it smaller. You shaped it. You called it something. You found a phrase that felt close enough, and then you repeated that phrase. To friends, to therapists, to yourself. And eventually the phrase replaced the feeling. That sips the thing about language. It doesn't just express memory. It consumes it. Like an animal that eats what it loves. And so, every time you remember that grief, you recall the sentence, not the sensation. The sentence is safe. The sentence is containable. But the truth? The truth was terrifying, which is why you buried it. In metaphor. But what if you could unbury it? What if, for just a moment, you could silence the narrator and feel the original thing? The sharp edge, the blinding light, the raw ache before it had a name. It would be unbearable. It would be holy. And it would vanish the second you tried to explain it. Because the act of naming is also the act of shrinking. To say, I am in love, is already to reduce something infinite into 3 tiny words. To say, I am broken, is to declare yourself complete enough to have shattered. Even the word truth is a label on a box we cannot open. Because real truth doesn't fit inside a sentence. It pulses. It breathes. It burns. But you can carry a burn forever. So you write it down. You tell the story. You reduce it. You survive it. But you don't remember it. You remember the shadow. And maybe that sip's okay. Maybe language is not a villain. Maybe it sips a kindness. A filter that lets you live with things too large to hold. But tonight, in this stillness, before the next thought comes, before the next word rises, before the truth is named, just feel it. That echo. That hum in your spine. That flicker behind your ribs. That is what you forgot. That is what the sentence swallowed. That is what you lived. Before you learned to speak. Now breathe. Let the truth expand. Let it stay unnamed. Let it hurt. Let it glow. And let it be. Everything language could never hold. You believe time is linear. That it moves from then to now, to what comes next. You tell yourself stories with beginnings, middles and ends. You say things like, back when I was a child, or someday I will. But what if you've never actually lived in a straight line? What if it only feels that way? Because your language demanded it. Think of time not as a line, but as a field. Messy, swirling, ever present. The now overlaps with the before. The before leaks into the next. And memory, your precious, fragile memory, is just the illusion of a sequence you can bear to carry. But language doesn't set like that. Language needs order. Grammar needs subjects. Verbs need tenses. So the mind, obedient, afraid of chaos, learns to bury time in structure. You learn to say, it happened. You learn to say it seps over. You learn to say, it will never return. And so, piece by piece, you lower moments into the ground. Not because they are dead, but because they are no longer grammatically correct. You bury them in past tense verbs. You shroud them in punctuation. You declare them finished, even when they sit still alive in your body. This is the quiet funeral of language. You say, my father left when I was 8, as if the sentence makes it finished. But some part of you still wakes up looking for him. You say, I used to love them, as if the word used to can kill a feeling. But your skin still shivers when you smell their perfume. Language draws the line. But your nervous system never signed the contract, because time does not live in language. It lives in sensation, and sensation is timeless. The brain too conspires in this illusion. Neuroscientist David Eagleman writes that the brain doesn't perceive time passively, it actively constructs it. In fact, your experience of now is actually a delay, a rolling window of milliseconds your brain stitches together to make you feel like time is smooth. But it isn't it. It sits patchwork. It sits stitched. And what sits doing the stitching? Language. You say, first, then finally. You say, before, after, always. You say, forever. But none of those words exist in the real world. You serve, never touched a then. You stiv, never smelled an after. They are only signposts. Little flags planted on the landscape of experience. But flags are not territory. They serve declarations, not realities. So when you tell your story, when you say this happened, what you really mean is, this is where I decided to bury that moment. You enter it in grammar. You fold it into past tense. You tell it again and again, until the story covers the wound. But sometimes the soil shifts. You walk into a room, and the smell of dust and rain brings it back. Suddenly, you are 6 years old again. Not metaphorically, biochemically. Your brain reactivates the moment as if it sends now. Because to the body, time never ended. Only the sentence did. This is how trauma survives. It doesn't obey tenses. You say, it happened years ago. But your breath still quickens. Your fists still clench. Your thoughts still spiral. Because no matter how many times you narrate it, the body remembers the part that had no words. The part that language couldn't bury. And so you live in both timelines. The one language allowed you to tell, neatly wrapped in paragraphs, archived in your identity, and the one still flickering beneath your skin. You believe closure is something you say, but maybe closure is just when you stop trying to name it. Maybe healing isn't moving on. Maybe it's stepping outside of the sentence entirely, letting time be wild again, letting now and then blur, letting yourself remember, without turning it into a performance. Because time doesn't care about your grammar. It doesn't care about what should be over. It only cares about what sits still vibrating. You are a chorus of unresolved chords. Not a timeline. Not a plot. But language wants plot. It needs chapters. And so, you keep writing them. This was the year I changed. That was the summer I lost myself. As a child, I always... But you are not a book. You are a storm. A spiral. A field of echoes. And those echoes don't end. They just grow quiet. until something stirs them. So maybe the goal is not to finish the story. Maybe it's to sit with the parts that never fit in the first place. The moment's language buried, but memory kept breathing. Now close your eyes. Let time untangle. Let grammar dissolve. Let then and now hold hands. And remember, you are not your timeline. You are not your sentence. You are what remains. When language runs out, you don't remember what happened. You remember how you describe what happened. And that might sound like a small difference, but it isn't set. It steps everything, because description isn't set neutral. It steps architecture. It sets decision. You choose what to highlight, what to leave out, what verbs to use, what metaphors to lean on, what tense to fix it in. And those choices don't just shape how you tell the memory. They shape what the memory becomes. The moment itself is gone. What remains is the sentence. And the sentence is the memory now. You might believe that memory is a vault, a locked container you reach into and pull from. But neuroscientist Karim Nader proved otherwise. Memory is not stored like a file. It is reconstructed every time you retrieve it. Each recall is a rewrite. Each description becomes the next draft. And so, the act of describing isn't passive. It stops sculpting. You chisel away details you no longer need. You smooth over contradictions. You reinforce the emotional tone until it feels like fact. And eventually, you forget what you forgot. You still left with a polished scene, a highlight reel. But beneath it, the raw footage is rotting, because memory doesn't preserve. It performs. Think about the last time you told someone a personal story. Did you pause? Did you edit as you spoke? Did you skip something because it didn't matter? Now imagine telling it again, but differently, from a new angle, with a new ending, a new villain, a different you. Would it still be true? Or would it become something else entirely? This is the paradox. The more you describe, the less you remember. Because description replaces sensation, it reorders the moment, and the original becomes irretrievable. You say, "My mother was distant." But what do you really remember? The look in her eyes? The way she turned away? Or just the phrase you've told yourself over and over? Maybe she was quiet. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she was in pain. But the word distant wraps all of that in one simple label, and the label becomes the memory. This is not just personal. It's cultural. The way your society talks about grief, love, power, those words become templates, and your mind fits your life into them. Even when they don't quite fit. You describe a breakup as heartbreak, because that's what the culture taught you. But maybe it wasn't that. Maybe it was disorientation. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was nothing, and you only felt sad, because sadness was the expected description. Memory doesn't form in isolation. It borrows language, and language borrows expectations. So you don't just describe what you felt. You describe what you supposed to have felt. And memory, obedient as always, adapts. This is the machinery of narrative identity. You tell your life like a novel, with chapters, arcs, and turning points. But the story isn't real. It's just the result of recursive description, the same way a painter returns to the canvas, and adds a stroke, blends a shadow, covers a mistake. You return to your memories, and rephrase them, until eventually, the canvas doesn't match the sketch, but you forgotten there ever was a sketch. And now, the painting is who you are. This is why therapy often begins with story, and ends in silence. You come in describing, "This is what happened to me. This is why I am this way." But eventually you begin to notice the gaps, the edits, the assumptions hiding inside the description, and then the real work begins. Because the moment you realize your memory is not what happened, but how you been describing it, you realize you not trapped in the past. You trapped in a sentence. And sentences can change, but not easily. The words have weight. The metaphors are sticky. Once you call yourself abandoned, you build your life around that word. You expect it. You fear it. You interpret every silence as confirmation. Not because it sits true, but because your memory has been described that way for so long, you forgot it had any other shape. So what happens when you change the description? I wasn't sit abandoned, I was left, and I lived. I wasn't step broken, I was hurt, and I grew. I wasn't step weak, I was human. The memory shifts. The shape rearranges, and you feel something uncoil. Not because the past changed, but because the way you speak about it did. And that changes everything. Now breathe. Feel the moment before language kicks in. The raw sensation. The quiet presence. The pulse beneath the word. That sips the memory that never got described. The one that still lives. In full color. Now let it stay that way. Don't sit, touch it. Don't set name it. Just let it be. What it always was. Yours. You think you remember the face. You think you remember the place. The moment. The smell. The feeling. But what lingers, what truly survives, is the word. The one that cut. The one that stayed. The one that changed the shape of everything after. Words are not just labels. They are anchors. And memory clings to them, even when all else dissolves. Think about your earliest clear memory. Go there now. Walk through the fragments. The color of the wall. The weight of the air. The tremble in your hands. But then, listen. Is there a word hiding in the corner? Someone said something. You said something. A phrase, a name. A single syllable wrapped in meaning. And that word, not the sight, not the scene, is what brought the memory back. You didn't just remember. You were summoned by language. That sips how deep it goes. In 1974, psychologists Loftus and Palmer conducted a now famous study. They showed participants videos of a car crash. Then they asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Others were asked the same question, but with the word smashed instead of hit. The results? Those who heard smashed remembered the cars going faster. They were more likely to recall broken glass, even though there was none. Why? Because memory didn't store the image. It stored the word. The word changed the shape of the memory. And it does this every day. You don't remember that you were anxious. You remember calling it panic. You don't remember feeling misunderstood. You remember the word ignored. You don't remember what they said. You remember what you called it afterward. And now, that word owns the memory. You repeat it in your head. You write it in your journal. You say it to a friend. And every repetition re-etches the memory, with deeper grooves. Not because the event changed, but because the word you attached to it grew heavier. This is the weight of language. It starts not the size of the experience. It sims the size of the word. A child may hear shame once, and carry it for life. Not because they understood it, but because it was spoken when they were vulnerable. And now the word lives in their nervous system, waiting for years, until it becomes a lens. And suddenly, everything is shame. Every silence, every mistake, every glance. You remember the word, and the word rewrites the world. But this isn't just psychological. It's biological. The brain encodes language differently than image. Words activate Broca-CIPS and Wernicke-CIPS areas, centers tied to meaning, structure, logic. Images fade faster. Words stick. That sips why you forget the face, but remember the insult. That sips why you forget the room, but remember the sentence. That sips why you don't cry because of the memory. You cry because of what it meant. And what it meant was carried on the back of a word. So here sips the question. What word has followed you, without your consent? What phrase sits beneath your thoughts, waiting to remind you who you used to be? Sometimes it sits subtle. You say, I step, fine. But what you mean is, I'd have been told not to speak. You say, I sit am strong. But what you mean is, no one ever helped me. You say, I don't remember. But what you mean is, I remember the word too well. Language allows us to survive the unbearable, but it also traps us in meanings we never chose. And over time those meanings become your identity. Not because they sip true, but because they were spoken when you were soft enough to absorb them. You remember the word, and the word became you. But here sits the strange mercy. You can change the word. You can revisit the memory and offer it a new name. Not to erase it, not to rewrite history, but to give it space to breathe. Maybe what you Sib always called failure was actually learning. Maybe what you labeled abandonment was survival. Maybe shame was simply a feeling no one helped you hold. You remember the word, but you don't have to keep it. Let it go. Not by forgetting the story, but by reclaiming the sentence. Tonight, sit with the word that haunts you. Say it softly. Hear it in the voice it arrived in. And then, ask it to leave. Or better yet, ask it to change. Now breathe. Let a new word rise. Not louder, just truer. Something softer. Something you were never taught, but always needed. Let that word carry the memory now. Let that word be you. Some wounds bleed. Others whisper. And some live on as sentences. They don't set swell. They don't sting. But they echo. A phrase. A judgment. A sentence spoken once. That never stopped speaking. You remember the sentence more than the moment. Because the cut healed, but the sentence stayed. You were 8, maybe 9. You dropped a glass. And someone said, "You always ruin things." Just once. In passing. Not even shouted. But that line made a scar. You didn't just understand it fully, but your body did. Your nervous system flinched. Your breath held. Your gaze fell. And the sentence slipped under your skin and built a room there. Years later, you still clean up too fast. You apologize before you speak. You panic at the sound of breaking glass. Not because of the glass, but because of the sentence. You always ruin things. That sentence made a scar. Not all pain is physical. Not all trauma is loud. Some arrives in perfect grammar. It uses punctuation like a knife. It embeds itself between syllables. And it waits. Because the mind forgets events. But it remembers the lines. And those lines become scripts. You recite them without realizing. I stum difficult. I stim too much. No one stays. It stim's my fault. Are these thoughts? Or inherited sentences? Sometimes they were said to you. Sometimes you said them to yourself. But either way, they live in you now. Not as observations, but as laws. Because that sips the thing about sentences. They claim authority. A single phrase, repeated enough, can become more powerful than 1,000 truths. The brain loves efficiency. It compresses complexity into language. It takes a universe of feeling and seals it inside a line. But that compression distorts. You weren't set always a burden. You weren't set always wrong. You weren't sit always unlovable. You were just told you were. Once, or twice, or enough. And now the sentence sits behind your smile. You say, I don't set know why I set 'em like this. But you do. You stare still carrying a paragraph that someone else wrote. And it sips shaped everything since. This is what cognitive scientists call schema. Mental frameworks built from early experience. But those frameworks are language bound. They spur constructed from what was said, and how often it was said. And they don't just store memory. They shape how you interpret reality. A compliment arrives. You edit it. A connection forms. You doubt it. A success happens. You brace for loss. But because of the sentence still echoing, I sit not enough. I ruin things. It never lasts. These aren't sit scars on your skin. They sit scars on your syntax. And the mind, trying to survive, uses those scars as structure. It builds your personality around them. Not because they sepa true, but because they sit familiar. And what sits familiar feels safe. Even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. But here sips what no one tells you. A sentence can be rewritten. Not denied. Not erased. But rephrased. A scar doesn't disappear. But it can soften. And the story doesn't have to end where the sentence began. Take that line. The one you can forget. Write it down. Look at it. Speak it. Feel where it lands in your body. Now ask, who said this? Did they mean it? Were they hurting? Were they wrong? Was it true? Or just loud? And then, try rewriting it. Turn "you ruin everything" into "you made a mistake and you learned." Turn "I am not lovable" into "I was not loved the way I needed." Turn "it's my fault" into "I was blamed because they couldn't face themselves." The sentence shifts, the scar breathes, the memory reopens, but now there sips air. This is not toxic positivity. This is linguistic surgery. You are not rewriting the past. You are reauthoring the frame. You are changing the sentence, so it stops writing you. Because memory is a book. You didn't yet always get to edit. But now, you hold the pen. So when the sentence comes again, and it will, meet it with a new one. Let it land. Then speak louder. I am not that voice. I am not that story. I am not that scar. Let your voice be the rewrite. Let your words become the healing. Now breathe. Feel the scar. Not as shame, but as proof you survived the sentence. And tonight, let a new sentence arrive. I am more than what was spoken. You don't remember the first time you misremembered, but it happened. Quietly. Like a skipped heartbeat. Like a comma added mid-sentence. You told the story, and it sounded right. It felt right, but it wasn't what happened. Not exactly. Maybe you changed the order. Maybe you left something out. Maybe you softened the edge, or made it sharper. But the moment you described it, it was no longer memory. It was narrative. And narrative does not preserve. It performs. This was the first misremembering. It wasn't a lie. It was a necessity. Because raw memory is chaos. It has no order, no logic, no structure. And language needs structure. So you revised. You summarized. You filled in blanks. You named things that didn't have names at the time. And in doing so, you changed it. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even conscious. It was survival. Your brain, trying to make sense. Trying to file it in the right drawer. Trying to make it yours. Because what sits not described feels foreign. And what sits not named feels unsafe. So you shaped the memory. And the shape became the memory. But now, you believe it never changed. That sits the illusion. You think memory is a photograph. But it sits more like a story told by a forgetful poet. Beautiful, compelling, and always shifting. Neuroscience confirms this. When you recall a memory, you sit not pulling it from a shelf. You sit rebuilding it. In real time. You reactivate the neurons. You fill in gaps with inference. You smooth the jagged edges. And every recall is a rewrite. Each time you remember, you start remembering the last time you remembered. Not the original. So that first misremembering, it was the start of a chain. 1,000 retellings later, you don't stand to know what happened. You only know what survived repetition. The misremembering became memory. And now, it feels true. That sits the trick of fluency. The more often you think something, the easier it is to recall. And the easier it is to recall, the more real it feels. Truth becomes indistinguishable from frequency. You remember being the outcast. But maybe you just didn't speak much that year. You remember your childhood as cold. But maybe it was only that one winter. You remember the ending as inevitable. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it never had to end at all. But you told the story. You added the punctuation. You chose the verbs. And so it solidified. Your memory is not what you lived. It stops what you made livable. And sometimes, what you needed to believe was more comforting than what actually occurred. You needed to be the hero, or the victim, or the one who saw it coming, or the one who tried their best. So you wrote that version. You carved it in language, and you've been carrying it ever since. But what sips beneath that version? What's hiding under the convenience of description? Maybe your misremembering isn't set wrong, just incomplete. Maybe there sips a child in the memory you forgot to protect. Maybe there sips a version of you who didn't speak because there was no word for what you felt. And maybe that sips where the truth lives, not in the sentence, but in the silence you skipped over. You said, "I was fine." But there was a pause before that. A breath you didn't sit mention. A tremble you ignored. That pause, that moment, was the original. The memory before the misremembering. You buried it with language, because language felt safer than feeling. But now, maybe you sit ready to return, not to the story, but to the moment before it was told. Not to the version you rehearsed, but to the wordless reality that waited underneath. The first misremembering was the first self-defense, and it worked. It protected you. It gave you order. It let you speak. But you don't have to protect yourself from the truth anymore. You can visit it. You can listen. You can feel the heat of what you once couldn't set name. You can say, "I don't know if this is how it happened," and mean it. Because honesty is not accuracy. It subts willingness. Willingness to sit in the uncertainty. To unwrite. To unwind. Now, breathe. Close your eyes. Step back behind the first sentence. Feel what still flickers there. And let the misremembering rest. It got you here. That sip's enough. You said it before. "I don't know why I remember this." A shadow of a hallway. The sound of shoes on tile. A cold window somewhere. A face you can sit quite place. No story. No explanation. But it lingers. You don't know what it means. You don't know when it happened. But you remember. So what are you remembering? This is the mystery of implicit memory. The memory that lives, not in facts, not in sentences, but in the body. In 1970, neuroscientist Brenda Milner studied a patient named H.M., a man whose hippocampus had been surgically removed to treat seizures. After the surgery, he couldn't form new explicit memories. He couldn't recall names, dates, or conversations. But he could still learn. He could trace shapes faster with each trial. His hands remembered what his mind couldn't set. He was remembering, without knowing. This is how much of your life works. You walk into a room and feel tense. You meet someone and immediately feel unsafe. You smell something and want to cry. But there sits no story, no narrative, just a feeling, a reaction with no known source. And your language tries to catch up. You say, "I don't know what sip's wrong," or "I must be overreacting." But you stir not. You just remembering something that was never described. And that means your conscious mind can sit to explain it. But your nervous system doesn't need a narrator. It remembers patterns. It remembers threat. It remembers comfort, even if you don't set. This is why therapy can feel so disorienting. You begin to uncover things that never had words. And the moment you try to explain them, you risk distorting them. Because some memories were never known. They were just lived. And they stayed alive. Not in your mind, but in your habits, your reflexes, your breath. You think remembering means recalling a story, but sometimes it means recognizing a pattern. You notice. You freeze when someone raises their voice. You flinch when someone reaches for your hand too quickly. You struggle to trust comfort. And when you try to explain why, you can sit. Because the why is not in language. It's in memory that was never linguistically encoded. Remembering without knowing is like feeling a scar, but forgetting the cut. But the scar is still there. It still shapes how you move. So much of who you are is built on memories you can access directly. You weren't given the words, or you were too young, or it was too overwhelming, or too quiet. So your body archived it, not in sentences, but in sensations. You think your fear of abandonment started at 16, but maybe it was 20 silent moments before that. A late pickup, a broken promise, a parent's unreadable face. You don't remember them, but your body does. And every time something feels familiar, without context, you still remembering without knowing. The mind doesn't sit like this. It wants coherence. It wants story. So it invents reasons. It says, "I am just dramatic. I am too sensitive. I have trust issues." But those aren't set reasons. They attempts to describe What never had a narrator? Your inner child isn't sipped trying to be difficult. They sit trying to speak in the only language they know. And that language is not made of words. It's made of temperature, of posture, of the way your stomach drops when someone says, "We need to talk." And maybe that sip's where healing begins, not in forcing memories to speak, but in learning to listen to what never needed speech. You can honor what you don't set understand. You can comfort what you can sit explain. You can say, "I don't know where this came from," and still trust that it matters. Because remembering doesn't require knowing. It only requires presence. Think of a song you haven't heard in years. You can recall the lyrics until the music starts. Then it sips all there, word for word, emotion for emotion. That sips how the body works. It waits for the cue. Then it remembers. Not with logic, with rhythm. Now imagine what else is waiting. In your skin, in your breath, in the quiet ways you brace for the world. There are memories inside you that never made it to language. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too early, too soft, too deep. And now they wait to be felt, not solved. Tonight, don't try to remember. Just allow the unknown to speak. Not in words, but in warmth, in chills, in tears without origin. That sips not confusion. That sips remembering. And it matters. Even if it never becomes a sentence. Even if it never fits into story. Even if it never gets explained. Because your life began before you could describe it. And some of the most important parts still live there. Now breathe. Let the knowing go. Let the remembering rise. Let the unspeakable memory find its voice in silence. At some point, the story started telling you, not the other way around. You thought you were narrating your life, explaining it, understanding it. But quietly, gradually, the fiction took on your voice. It borrowed your memories. It studied your wounds. And it began to wear your face. You became a character in a story that was easier to survive than the truth. And now you can tell the difference. Where do you end and the narrative begin? You say, "I've always been this way." But what you mean is, repeated this sentence so many times that it fits like skin. You don't remember the moment you decided who you were, but you remember the phrase, "I sid'em, the quiet one. I'd stim the fixer. I always mess it up. I stem the strong one. I sip'em the broken one." These are not truths. They stir roles, constructs, masks made of syntax. And somewhere along the way, you forgot they were optional. Because repetition becomes identity. Tell a child a story about themselves, often enough, and they will become it. Tell yourself a story about yourself, often enough, and you still forget you made it up. Psychologist Jerome Bruner called this narrative psychology. The idea that we don't just remember our lives, we compose them. And once composed, we mistake the fiction for fact. Because it sounds comforting. Because it sits clean. Because it explains why we feel what we feel, without having to feel it all over again. But what gets lost? Everything that didn't fit the plot. You remember the heartbreak, but not the gentleness that followed. You remember the betrayal, but not the part where you opened your heart anyway. You remember the sentence, "They never loved me," but not the complexity that could have rewritten it. Fiction simplifies. Fiction edits. And fiction wears your face. You build a story so that you don't have to hold the entire truth. But in doing so, you also lose pieces of yourself. You forget the versions of you that didn't survive the script. The brave one. The uncertain one. The one who didn't speak, but noticed everything. The one who could have chosen differently, if only the story had allowed it. But the plot was already written. You already had your role. And so you stayed in character. Even when it hurt. Even when it was lonely. Even when the lines stopped sounding like you. You kept performing, because the performance was safer than the silence. And now, the fiction is so convincing that even you believe it. But here sits the quiet fracture. You still feel the parts of you that didn't make it into the script. They come up as longing, as restlessness, as the sense that something sips missing. You scroll, you work, you distract. But beneath it all, there sips a whisper. This isn't set the whole story. And it isn't set. Because who you are is not the sentence you repeat. It sips the space before the sentence. It steps the breath between roles. It sips the moment when you forget what you were supposed to say and just feel. The fiction can hold that. It sups too alive, too unpredictable, too real, and so it gets edited out. But you can bring it back. You can pause the performance. You can say, I don't know who I am outside this story. And let that be a beginning, not a crisis, not a failure, a beginning. Because all fiction is constructed. And what is constructed can be deconstructed. You are not your plot. You are the author. Even if you forgot, even if the ink dried decades ago, you can still pick up the pen. You can say, I don't want to be the one who always suffers. I don't want to be the caretaker. I don't want to be the villain in someone else's memory. You can write a new chapter without having to burn the old ones. Because rewriting isn't set denial. It sets reclamation. You can love the character you've been and still grow beyond them. Now breathe. Look in the mirror. Notice how the story looks back at you. Softened by time. Heavy with metaphor. Familiar, but not final. Fiction wears your face, only if you keep handing it the mask. So tonight, take it off. Let your reflection be unfinished. Let your story be unwritten. Let yourself exist, without an ending. And remember, you were never just the character. You were always the space between the lines. You are not a name. You are not a story. You are not even a memory. You are syntax. Not just the content of your thoughts, but their structure. How you place yourself in a sentence. Where the I goes. What verbs you choose. How you bind yourself to meaning. You think you stir saying who you are. But what you are really doing is following the rules of language you never consciously chose. I was broken. I am healing. I will be better. Each phrase a timeline. Each tense a trap. Each syntax a scaffolding. For a self you had to invent to survive. Language didn't just teach you how to speak. It taught you how to be. It told you that identity is a noun. That growth is linear. That existence can be diagrammed. Like a sentence on a chalkboard. Subject. Verb. Object. Wal issue. Want. Love. I days. Was. Left. I she. Am alva. Enough. But what if you weren't meant to be that tidy? What if you were meant to be a parenthesis? A fragment? An unfinished sentence that loops back on itself? The syntax of the self is not simple. It is recursive. It folds inward. It contradicts. It rewrites itself mid-thought. You are not a paragraph. You are an ellipsis. Psychologists like Dan McAdams have shown that people form identity, not just from what they remember, but how they tell what they remember. Syntax is not a mirror. It stops a mold. It doesn't just reflect who you are. It shapes who you become. When you say, I always ruin things, so you place yourself as subject and cause. The verb is absolute. The object is pain. That sentence becomes a law, and your self folds into it. But change the syntax, and the meaning unravels. Say instead, things fall apart. I get caught inside. Now the verb floats. The blame diffuses. The self breathes. This is not wordplay. This is identity surgery. You don't just describe yourself. You construct yourself through structure. Language is not passive. It is architecture. And the grammar you have inherited is not neutral. It is cultural, emotional, generational. In English, we begin with I feel, I want, I need. The self is always the anchor, the axis. But in other languages, Japanese for instance, the subject is often dropped. The sentence focuses on the action, not the actor, which means the identity formed within that structure feels less centralized, less fixed. So imagine, Who would you be? If your syntax didn't always start with I? What if your inner grammar allowed room for ambiguity? What if it made space for silence? Because sometimes, the truest things we feel don't yet fit into language at all. They exist in the margins, the unsaid, the pauses. But our minds, trained by syntax, fill those spaces too quickly. We say, I feel empty. Instead of sitting with the quiet, we say, I should be happy, because that sips what the sentence demands. But what if you let the clause hang unfinished? What if you stop trying to wrap every emotion in grammar? You might discover that the self doesn't live in the sentence. It lives in the tension between sentences, in the space where you don't yet know what to say, where the I dissolves, where the structure breaks, where the meaning blurs. That is where you are. Not the story, not the label, not even the memory, but the syntax trying to hold them together. And maybe, just maybe, you don't have to hold them so tightly. You can say, I am becoming. Not I am broken. Not I am fixed. Just becoming. Syntax without full stop. A self in progress. A sentence in motion. Now breathe. Notice how you speak to yourself. Not what you say, but how. Do you allow pauses? Do you use absolutes? Do you bind your identity with grammar that no longer serves you? Try this. Leave the sentence unfinished. Let the clause dangle. Let the thought fade. Before it concludes, let yourself be something language hasn't yet learned how to describe, because the self you built from words and lines is not the only self there is. You were something before you were a sentence. And you still are. Now close your eyes. Let the syntax dissolve. Let the sentence unravel. Let the I rest. And in that space, between the verb and the object, between what you said and what you meant, let the real you begin again. Language tries, but it gets it wrong. It wants to help you remember. It wants to be your map, your anchor, your script. But memory isn't loyal, and language is worse. Because every time you describe the past, you distort it. Not because you lie, but because the words aren't exact. They never are. You say, it was love. But was it? Or was it dependency? Or longing? Or relief disguised as romance? You say, I was fine. But maybe you just didn't know how to explain the quiet ache. You hadn't learned the word for yet. Language fills the space with whatever word is closest, not whatever word is truest. And once it picks the word, it defends it. Language is stubborn like that. Once it labels a feeling, it insists on being right. You say, I was angry, but maybe you were scared. You say, I moved on, but maybe you didn't. And now, the sentence has settled into memory. So deeply, you can find what was under it anymore. This is the paradox. Language allows memory to survive, but only in a version it can carry. A simplified version. A cleaned-up version. A version that fits inside a sentence. But your life never fit inside a sentence. So what parts of it have been misspelled? You remember the breakup, because you called it heartbreak. But what if it was freedom, and you just didn't have that word yet? You remember your childhood as lonely. But what if it was quiet? And you only learned later that silence could mean abandonment. Language doesn't just distort. It retroactively reshapes. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus showed how easy it is to implant false memories, using only words. A simple change, like calling a car crash a smash instead of a bump, makes people remember more damage, even broken glass that wasn't there. Language doesn't record the past. It overwrites it, like an old tape, rewritten every time you press play. So every time you tell your story, you make new edits. And eventually you forget the editing happened at all. You just say, this is how it was. Even though was is built from approximations. Memory isn't a recording. It's a construction. And language is the builder. But it often uses the wrong tools. And here sips the deeper problem. We trust language too much. We believe that naming something gives us control over it. But sometimes, Naming something makes us miss it entirely. You say trauma, but what you mean is the absence of gentleness. You say failure, but what you mean is a necessary detour. You say shame, but what you mean is a wound no one helped you carry. And now you remember those words, not the reality. And because the words feel solid, you think the memory is solid, but it sips not. It sips soft, mutable, breathing, and language keeps boxing it in. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is realizing that the memory you used to have been grieving was never the full thing. It was a description, a caption, a linguistic echo of something much larger. And that echo, repeated again and again, became your truth. But it was never the truth. It was just the version that fit the words you had, and maybe that sips all you could do at the time. You needed to say, it was love. Even if it wasn't say, you needed to say, I stim fine. Even if you weren't sit, you needed the sentence to survive the chaos. But now, maybe you don't sit. Maybe you sit ready to let the sentence bend, to let the label lift, to let the memory breathe without a title. Because sometimes the most healing thing is to say, I don't know what it was, and let that be enough. Let the ambiguity return. Let the original unspoken memory rise again, in color, in smell, in sensation, without trying to name it, without trying to explain, because explanation is not always truth. Sometimes it sips a hiding place. Now breathe. Think of a memory you used to have told 100 times. The one with the rehearsed lines, the practiced pain, the tidy conclusion. Now imagine peeling away the words. All of them. No adjectives. No plot. No labels. What sips left? A flicker. A temperature. A gesture. A silence. That might be the real memory. The one language couldn't get to. The one language remembered wrong. Let that one stay unspoken. Let it be what it is, without having to say what it is. Now, sleep. Let the sentence fall away. Let the memory uncoil. Let what was never quite right finally be allowed to simply be. There are things you remember thinking, clear, sharp, certain. But what if you never actually thought them? What if you only think you did? A feeling arises. Later, you name it. Much later, you turn it into a thought, as if it had always been there. But it hadn't sit. It was a reconstruction, a caption added to a picture, long after it was taken. Your brain doesn't store internal monologue like a script. It stores sensations, fragments, flash impressions. And then, when prompted, it generates a thought to explain what was probably happening. The thought feels original, but it sips a forgery. This is the haunting mechanism of confabulation. The brain fills gaps, not with lies, but with believable truths. You still are not lying when you say, I knew something was wrong. You just didn't think it at the time. You stir not dishonest when you say, I told myself to be strong. You just filled in the silence with a sentence that made it survivable. You stir remembering a thought that never actually occurred, and that sits more common than you think. In 1985, psychologist Ulrich Neisser coined the term flashbulb memory, memories of intense events that feel photographically vivid. But when tested years later, people's descriptions changed, not just in detail, but in internal dialogue. They remembered thinking things they never said. They remembered decisions they never made. Because thoughts, like memories, can be retrofitted, and language is the tool. You say, I knew it was over. But did you? Or did you feel a tremble in your gut, and only later attach the thought? You say, I told myself to be calm. But maybe you were frozen, and now the phrase is damage control. You stir not deceiving anyone. You stir just narrating yourself, with tools your brain gave you, long after the moment passed. Because silence is unbearable, a blank space in the story, impossible. So you add the sentence. And now, the sentence feels like it was always there, but it wasn't set. It sets a memory of a thought that never happened. And yet, now it shapes your identity. You say, I am the kind of person who sees it coming, because your brain reverse engineered that belief from an ending you survived. But that knowing wasn't set there when it mattered. You are building a sense of self from post-processed logic, and that self is convincing, even to you, because it feels fluent. It feels organized. It feels like a story worth believing. And most of the time, you need it. You need to think, I stayed because I loved them. You need to think, I left because I respected myself. Even if, in the moment, you weren't thinking at all. Even if you were simply reacting, breathing, collapsing, choosing with your body, what your language hadn't yet caught up to. This is the mystery of cognition. You don't start think, and then act. You act, and then think about the action, after the fact. And yet, you remember it in reverse. You think, I decided. But often, you only narrated the decision after it was made. And that narration became the memory of a thought that never really occurred. So what are you holding on to that never actually passed through your mind until much, much later? What beliefs were born in hindsight? What identities were constructed from sentences you told yourself to survive the ambiguity? This doesn't make them false. It makes them adaptive. But if you mistake them for real-time truth, you start confusing fiction for intuition. You might avoid love because you remember thinking you weren't ready when really you just froze. You might believe you wise because you recall seeing the pattern when really you just fit a story around the pain. You remember a thought, but it was never yours. It was built later from words. This doesn't mean you said broken. It means you see human. The mind protects itself by turning emotion into narrative. It turns absence into insight. It turns blankness into I always knew. But if you listen closely, really closely, you can hear the silence beneath the sentence. The space where the thought never was. And that silence is honest. Not neat. Not smart. But real. You are not only what you think. You are what you didn't know. You are the pause. Before you invented meaning. And maybe that's okay? Maybe you don't need to remember the sentence to validate the experience. Maybe I didn't know what I thought is the most honest thing you'd ever say. Now breathe. Think of the thought that shaped your memory, the one you remember saying to yourself. Let it soften. Let it float. Ask it, were you there at the time? And if it doesn't answer, that's your answer. And that's enough. Because truth doesn't always come in sentences. Sometimes it sits just a pulse. And sometimes memory isn't what you thought. It sits what you felt. Before you gave it words, it never needed. Before you gave it a name, you felt it. The ache, the warmth, the surge in your chest like rising water. It was just sensation. Raw, undefined, whole. But then someone asked, what's wrong? And you had to choose a word. Sad, anxious, lonely, fine. And just like that, the experience collapsed into a label. You didn't describe it. You replaced it. Because language is not just expression. It is compression. To name something is to shrink it into something speakable. But in doing so, you risk losing the shape it originally had. You might think, I was happy. But maybe it was something softer. Not joy, but peace. Not laughter, but presence. Not excitement, but safety. But those didn't feel like options. So you named it happy. And that became the memory. The name survived. The feeling did not. This is what philosopher Alfred Korzybski meant when he said, the map is not the territory. The word is not the thing. But once the word is spoken, the thing disappears. You label the feeling, and then forget what it felt like, before it had a name. It happens every day. You feel something strange in your chest. You pause. Your heart speeds. Your breath catches. Then someone says, that's anxiety. And now, that's all it is. It is no longer the flutter, the unknown, the maybe something more. It is anxiety. A word. a diagnosis, a name, and the name becomes the experience. Not because it sits true, but because your brain wants certainty more than it wants accuracy. Naming is soothing. Naming is control. But naming also erases. The child who was too sensitive stops trusting their instincts. The teenager who was lazy forgets how curiosity felt. The adult who is resilient stops admitting when they sipped are in pain. The name becomes the identity. The name becomes the memory. But what was there before the name? You were a blur, a warmth, a wondering, an edge not yet defined. You felt, but no one asked you to explain. And then, you learned to describe yourself. You said, I stem smart. I sit shy. I stim broken. I stem okay. But these were never truths. They were attempts to carry something language couldn't set hold. You didn't step become anxious. You were told what anxiety looked like. And then you found yourself in the definition. You didn't step become strong. You were praised for not needing help. So you folded into that name, even when it hurt. We confuse recognition with reality. But names are only as accurate as the moment they were given. And we rarely go back to check. So they stick. Forever. You say, I sep always been this way. But maybe you just never let yourself outgrow the label. You say, I sep's never been good at that. But maybe you just inherited someone else's definition of what good looks like. You say, I stem just not that kind of person. But who wrote the categories? Who benefits from the boxes? You didn't step name yourself first. The world did. And then you made those names your own. So what would happen if you forgot your names? If you stopped calling it failure and just felt what it did to your breath? If you stopped calling it confidence and just noticed the way your shoulders softened? What would return if you removed the label? What might you feel if you weren't trying to remember what it was called? Because every name you said given your pain was an attempt to give it borders. And every border was an act of forgetting. A forgetting of how vast the experience actually was. This doesn't set mean names are useless. Sometimes they save us. Naming a trauma gives it weight. Naming a feeling gives it form. Naming yourself gives you shape in a world that wants to erase you. But the danger is in thinking the name is the thing. It never is. The map is not the territory. The diagnosis is not the person. The label is not the life. And when you carry names too long, they become cages. You stop feeling what sips true. You only remember what it was called. Now breathe. Think of something in your life you least have named. A moment. A trait. A flaw. Say the name aloud. Then ask, what was here before I called it that? Let the answer arrive in images. In sensations. In silence. Don't step, narrate. Just notice. The name can wait. Because maybe your most vivid memories and set what happened, but what you were told it meant. Maybe the deepest version of you still lives beneath the label, waiting, wordless, whole. You think you sip always been this way, but you haven't set. This version of you, the way you speak, the way you flinch, the way you smile like punctuation, wasn't sit born. It was edited, line by line, interaction by interaction, story by story. You were rewritten, not all at once, not violently, quietly, subtly, lovingly, even by people who thought they were helping, by people who were hurting, by systems that didn't know your name, but still pressed your soul into shape. You didn't start out like this. You were raw data, curiosity with skin, laughter before language, trust before narrative. Then, someone handed you a mirror, etched with words. Too loud, too quiet, too emotional, too much. And you began editing yourself to match the reflection. The edit didn't happen in your thoughts. It happened in your memory. You remembered yourself the way others remembered you. You began to internalize external perception. You forgot the original version, the one that existed before you were explained. Because memory isn't set, just stored. It's overwritten. And identity is a palimpsest, A parchment scraped clean and re-inked, with more socially acceptable handwriting. They told you who you were, and over time, you told it back to yourself, until it felt true, until it became automatic. Now you say, I sip always been anxious. I sep always been the responsible one. I sip not creative. I stem not lovable. But these are not facts. They sit edits. Memories rehearsed until they replaced reality. Because that seps how memory works. It obeys rehearsal. It prioritizes consistency over truth. If you say it enough, your brain reinforces the neural pathways. It doesn't care if it sips accurate. It cares if it sips familiar. So the version of you that survives is the version that was repeated, and the parts that weren't sipped repeated, the ones no one mirrored back to you, the ones that didn't set fit the story, they were deleted. You didn't forget them. They were unwritten. And that sips why it sips so hard, to remember who you were, before the world taught you who to be. Because there's no language for what wasn't allowed. You were never taught to describe your softness, only your strength. You were never given a word for the kind of joy that didn't stick to look impressive, only for achievement. You were never asked to recall the first moment you felt free, only the first time you felt fear. So you remembered what the world named, and forgot what it ignored. You were rewritten, but not maliciously, just repeatedly. And repetition is all it takes. Even now, you correct yourself mid-sentence, because you anticipate being misunderstood. Even now, you perform comfort in conversations, because discomfort wasn't part of your script. Even now, you explain yourself, in the language of someone else, sipped expectations. But what would happen if you stopped mid-performance? If you paused the character? If you said, I don't remember where I got this line, but I don't want to say it anymore. What if the way you are is just the latest version of a sentence that sip's been edited too many times? And what if the original was still somewhere inside, not gone, just unread, buried under pages that someone else wrote? This isn't sept about blame. It stips about authorship. You didn't choose the early drafts. You were too young to hold the pen, but you spare holding it now. And you can revise, not by erasing what happened, but by making room for what also happened. The glimmers that didn't fit the plot, the smiles that no one noticed, the thoughts you never shared, the parts of you that refused to disappear, even when the story tried to delete them. Now breathe. Close your eyes. Think of a moment when you were you, before the world interfered. Maybe it sips blurry. Maybe it sips silent. That sip's okay. You still not remembering the scene. You still remembering the truth beneath the edits. You still remembering yourself, before the footnotes, before the corrections, before the version control. And that version is still here. Still flickering. Still intact. Still waiting to be spoken in your voice. Not the rehearsed one. Not the polished one. The voice that stutters. The one that trembles with honesty. The one that doesn't know the right word, but says it anyway. That sips the voice. That rewrites the rewrite. Not to return to the original, but to finally include it. Now sleep. Let the edited self rest. Let the rehearsed story go quiet. Let the raw version return. And remember, you are not the version they approved. You are what remained. When they tried to delete you, sometimes the words you say are not yours. They stir echoes, but they sound like you. A sentence slips out, and you realize you said it before, or someone else did. Years ago, in a different room, in a different life. But the voice feels familiar, and now it lives in your mouth. That sips how echoes work. They don't ask permission. They don't knock. They just return, quietly, and pretend they always belonged there. You might think you outgrown certain voices, but echoes don't need presence. They only need repetition. And once they echoed enough, they learn to speak. On your behalf. In your tone. Using your words. You say, I always ruin things. But whose voice is that? Is it your mother disappointment? A teacher sips sarcasm? A friend sets off hand joke that hit too hard? You don't sit remember exactly. You just remember that it felt true at the time. And because it felt true once, your brain kept the echo. Now, when you try something new, it speaks before you do. Now, when you feel joy, it whispers, "This one set last." Now, when you try to rest, it shouts, "You haven't earned this." And you call it your voice. But it isn't set. It steps memory wearing your accent. It's someone else steps judgment, disguised as self-awareness. This is how memory gets mistaken for identity. It doesn't return as images. It returns as language. Recursive. Automatic. Invisible. Psychologists call this internalized dialogue. It steps not what happened. It steps what was said, and said again, until the echo found its rhythm, until it stopped bouncing, and started scripting. Now the echo drives. Now the echo chooses your sentences. Before you even realize you stir speaking. You think you stare cautious, but maybe you sit just repeating an old warning from someone who didn't want you to leave them. You think you steer realistic, but maybe you sit just recycling a fear your parents lived inside. You think you steer grounded, but maybe you sit never given yourself permission to be free of the sentence that someone else left behind, because the echo doesn't fade when the person leaves. It grows louder in their absence, especially if you never got to answer it, especially if the last word wasn't yours. But you can respond now, not by silencing the echo, but by talking to it. Ask it, whose voice are you? Where did you come from? Are you here to protect me or control me? And wait. It might not answer in words. It might answer in memory, in heat, in nausea, in a scene you forgotten. And then you still understand. This isn't set about what happened. It sets about what was repeated. You weren't just shaped by events. You were shaped by how those events were described, by others, and by yourself. And every repetition cemented the echo sip's place in your mouth. But now you can teach it new lines. You can speak to yourself with a voice that sip's never been heard before. You can say, "I don't believe that anymore. I don't need to repeat that. That sip's not my sentence." And when the echo tries again, because it will, you can let it speak. Then speak louder. Not in volume. In truth. Not in anger. In clarity. Because every time you respond with a new sentence, you soften the old one. You loosen its grip. You give the echo something new to repeat. This is how healing happens. Not by erasing the echoes, but by retraining them until your internal voice starts to sound like your actual self. The one that wasn't made of fear. The one that wasn't edited by shame. The one that knows how to speak with softness. Now breathe. Think of a phrase you say to yourself often. One that hurts. Now trace it. Back. Further back. Before it became yours. Before you had a mouth. Where did it begin? Name it. Then, rephrase it. Say it again, but softer. Say it again, but true. The echo will listen. And eventually, it will echo you. Not the version of you that flinched, but the one who finally gets the last word. Now sleep. Let the old voice rest. Let the echo take a new form. Let your own sentence rise. And let it be the one you were never allowed to say. Until now, you think the past is behind you. But it isn't it. It steps underneath you, inside you, whispering in your habits, curling into your reactions, writing your now. It moved in. The past didn't stay where it belonged, without realizing, and it brought its furniture. You arrange your life around it. But sometimes, you stir just redecorating. You say you changed, the same old room, because the past doesn't need memory to survive. It only needs repetition. And you repeated it beautifully. In the way you say yes, when you want to say no. When you are uncomfortable. In the way you laugh too quickly. In the way you lower your voice. Around certain people. You are not reacting to this moment. You are responding to an echo. somewhere far back, a loop, a scene that already happened, but never really ended. Not as a story. You carried it. It became a system, but as a pattern. The past didn't set and leave. Psychologists call this procedural memory. It stops not what you remember. It stops what you become. You don't recall the original rejection, but you assume rejection is coming. You don't remember the first time you were told you were too much, but you scale yourself down before anyone can say it again. Your present isn't free, with stage directions written in a forgotten hand. It's a script. You call it personality. And the worst part? You say, I am just anxious. I not good with people. I don't trust easily. As if these were traits. But they are echoes. Adaptations. Memories masquerading as identity. You were built. You weren't born this way. By repetition. By context. By 100 invisible yesterdays. The past didn't teach you. It programmed you. And now, you live inside its instructions. But here's what no one tells you. The instructions are not final. You can rewrite them. But not by forgetting. By remembering differently. By noticing where the past is hiding. Inside the present. Because it is hiding. In your tone. In your posture. In your breath. When you tense up before being criticized. That sips the past. When you expect abandonment from kindness. That sips the past. When you reject good things. Before they can leave you. Over. And over. That sips the past rehearsing its script. And over. Until you call it reality. But it sips not. It sips memory, disguised as intuition. And it feels like now, because it never got resolved back then. So it keeps looping. But as reflex. Not as thought. You say, this is just who I am. But who you are was shaped by what you survived. And what you survived is still speaking through your actions. You stir not broken. You stir recursive. And recursion can be unlearned. Not by resisting it. Not by fighting the past. But by gently noticing. This is called awareness. How often it sits still steering. It seps not dramatic. It seps quiet. It sounds like, oh, that wasn't sept about this. It feels like, this panic doesn't match the moment. It begins with, what if this isn't the same story again? And in that pause, you open a door. You step outside the loop. You stop reenacting and start witnessing. And from that place, you can choose. You can say, I want to respond with now, not with then. You can say, I am not a child in this room. I am an adult with agency. You can say, the past created this reaction, but I don't have to carry it forward. You still are allowed to become what your past never imagined. Not in defiance, but in release. Now breathe. Feel the past in your shoulders, in your timing. Don't push it away. In your silence. Just see it. See how old it is. See how it still thinks it needs to protect you. Thank it. Then let it step aside. Because this present, this breath, this moment, doesn't belong to your history. It belongs to you. Not the version that flinched. Not the version that apologized too much. But the one sitting here now, ready to say, I don't need the past to keep writing my present. Now rest. Let the script fade. Let the loop unwind. Let today be the first page. You write without the ghost of yesterday sips pen. Your brain is full of scripts. Not metaphors. Not abstract patterns. Real neurological pathways. Written over time. By repetition, emotion, and survival. You don't remember every word you heard. But your brain does. In the folds. In the synapses. In the blood flow that changes. Every time a familiar sentence is spoken. There are phrases you've heard so often. They become architecture. They don't live in your memory. They are your memory. Not as stories, but as scripts. You hear a tone. Your shoulders tense. You see a certain face. You brace for disappointment. You receive praise. And your mind scans for sabotage. It's not personal. It's procedural. The brain remembers patterns, better than facts, especially when those patterns once kept you safe. So now, every situation is scanned for a familiar line of code. A script runs. Before you speak, before you think. You steer not always choosing your reactions. You steer reenacting old programming. The brain automates what it thinks is efficient. But efficient is not always accurate. Sometimes you set not anxious. You steer just running an old fear script from a room you haven't been in for years. Sometimes you sit not detached. You stir just playing the role you once needed to survive silence. Sometimes you sit not strong. You stir just too fluent in the script of suppression. And those scripts, they don't ask for consent. They play quietly, in the background. A sigh before a sentence. A glance toward the exit. A tightening in the gut, before anyone even says your name. Because the brain believes what it sips rehearsed, even if it was never true, even if it was never yours. Some of these scripts were not written by you at all. They were installed by parents, by schools, by institutions, by accident. You internalized them because you had to. And now they feel like instinct, but they sit just automation, not destiny, which means they can be rewritten, but not all at once. Not by affirmations, not by force. Scripts don't respond to shouting. They respond to interruption, a moment of pause, a breath before the pattern, a gentle question. Is this the right script for this moment? Because if it isn't, you can choose another. You can practice new words, new tone, new timing, and slowly, the old code weakens. This is what neuroplasticity means. You are not fixed. You are rewritable. Your brain is not a hard drive. It sips a living manuscript, editing itself every time you use it. So what if you stopped reciting the script of shame? What if you rewrote the script of worthlessness in a new font? What if your brain could learn a new sentence entirely? Something like, "Are some allowed to take up space?" Or, "Joy is not dangerous. My needs are not an inconvenience." At first it won't sound real. Your neurons will resist. The old pathway will flare. The brain hates inefficiency, and healing is inefficient. But with repetition, you make new grooves. With kindness, you soften the old ones. Eventually, a new script will run. Not because you forced it, because you lived it, because you practiced it, like a language. And one day, you'll be in a room. Someone will say your name. Your chest will tighten, and then relax. The script will begin, and then stop. You'll blink, and choose something else. A sentence you never said before. A breath that doesn't follow the usual rhythm. A smile not shaped by performance. And that moment, that microsecond of self-revision, will be your revolution. Now breathe. Think of the sentence you say to yourself, without noticing. The one that starts things, or ends them, or defines your worth. See it like code. See it like handwriting. Now imagine putting a line through it. Not erasing it. Just interrupting it. Now write something next to it. Something soft. Something true. Something unlearned. Let that sentence echo. Let it repeat. Let it find its way into the folds of you. Because your brain is listening. And it always remembers what you say. Again, and again, and again. Make it something worth remembering. Not just the idea, and your body remembers. You say, "I ran." But the feeling, the rhythm in your chest, the air pulling at your lungs, the gravity working against your heels. You speak the verb, and your brain fills in the rest. Because verbs are not just language, they are simulation. When you say, your nervous system tenses. "I fought," as if it's still happening. When you say, "I fell," your balance shifts slightly, as if the floor still remembers. Language doesn't just describe the past. It replays it. And when you use verbs, your brain reactivates the sensory motor patterns associated with that action. You simulate. You remember through movement, not thought. You speak. It's steps called embodied cognition. Your mind is not a separate narrator. Its steps a body with a memory problem, and verbs are the bridge. You say, I survived, and somewhere deep in your gut, the muscles you clenched back then tighten again. You say, I waited, and your spine curves slightly, like it did that day on the edge of the bed, checking the time, checking the door, checking yourself. These aren't set metaphors. They sit reactivations. You think memory is about facts, but it sits more often about verbs. Not what happened, but what you did, or what was done to you. And those verbs, they become identity. I was abandoned. I was praised. I was punished. I was held. Each verb etches itself into how you see yourself. Each verb becomes a script. You say, I failed enough times. You become the failure. You say, I endured enough times. You become the survivor. But what if the verbs you use aren't set, even accurate? You gave up. What if you were told, when really, you adapted? What if you were told, you broke down, when really, you paused? What if you were told, you lashed out, when really, you finally spoke? Language simplifies, but the body knows better. The brain wants a verb to organize the chaos, to shrink the moment into something sayable. But when the wrong verb is chosen, the wrong memory is stored, the narrative becomes skewed. You forget the complexity and remember only the caption. I lost. I stayed. I ruined it. I tried. And even now, as you whisper those words to yourself, your nervous system tightens, as if it's reliving it. You stir not recalling. You stir re-inhabiting. So what happens when you change the verb? You say, instead of, I failed, you say, I learned. I protected myself. Instead of, I ran away, you say, I asked. Instead of, I begged. The memory reshapes. The emotion shifts. The body relaxes. Because the verb isn't sit, just a word. It sets a doorway, and the one you choose decides what room you step into. Your brain is listening, and it believes you, not because it sits gullible, but because it sits embodied. The verb becomes a posture. The posture becomes a mood. The mood becomes a belief. So if you want to change what you believe, change the verbs. Choose paused over quit. Choose trusted over waited. Choose opened over broke. Choose became over lost. You stir not lying to yourself. You stir choosing a more accurate simulation. You stir choosing to remember what your body did, not just what the world called it. Now breathe. Pick a memory. Don't name it. Don't stick narrate it. Your body reaches for. Just notice the verb, the subtle motion, the tension, the pull. What sips the verb? Say it out loud. Then ask, is this the only way to describe what happened? Is there another verb that tells a different story? Let that new verb settle into your body. Let it rewrite the movement. Let it plant a new rhythm into your nervous system. Because memory isn't sit fixed. It sits kinetic. It doesn't sit live in photos. It lives in verbs. And the verbs you practice will become the future you believe in. Now sleep. Let the old verbs rest. Let the new ones echo. Let the body remember what the mind never knew how to say. You don't just dream in pictures. You dream in language. Not always in words, but in structure, in order, in sequence. Your brain speaks to itself, like a storyteller half asleep, mumbling metaphors into the folds of your mind. And memory listens, softly, wrongly, willingly. Language dreams memory, and then memory returns the favor. Even in sleep, you narrate the self. You assign names to symbols, verbs to gestures, meanings to moments that never happened. You dream of falling, and your brain translates that into failure. You dream of flying, and your brain labels it freedom. But here sits the thing. You don't let dream freedom. You dream motion. The language comes later. You wake up and name it. And the naming becomes the remembering. Not the dream itself, but the sentence you wrote after. That sips how memory works too. The event is one thing. The language you use to explain it is what stays. You remember what you called it, not what it was. You say that was the worst day of my life, and your brain nods. It stores that label, even if the day contained moments of softness, even if no single event justified the phrase. Language is a highlighter. Whatever it marks becomes vivid. The rest fades. You say, I ruined everything, and now, everything else that happened that day gets filed under ruin. You say, that conversation destroyed me, and now, the memory is stored in the body as catastrophe. Not because it was, but because the sentence said so. Language does not just describe the past. It defines how it will be remembered. And every time you repeat the phrase, you etch it deeper. The words dream the memory into shape. Even if they stare wrong, even if they sipped or inherited, even if they sit borrowed from someone who didn't set know your whole story. And yet, your brain believes the dream. Because it needs a narrator. It needs a structure. We cannot remember without language. At least not clearly. Not cohesively. Without words, experience becomes a fog. Moments blur. Emotion floats without anchor. So we name the fog. We give it lines. We assign it chapters. And in doing so, we hallucinate memory. Not falsely, but functionally, because the goal is not accuracy. It sense coherence. The brain favors a story over the truth. And language is the author. That sips why the words you use to explain your past matter more than the past itself. Change the words, and you change the weight. You change the mood. You change the memory. Not because you stir lying, because you sit your dreaming differently. Now think, what phrases have you repeated so many times? They sit become fact. Who gave you those words? Did you choose them? Did they fit? Or did they just sound right in someone else? Sip's mouth? Because language is contagious. We inherit our explanations. We borrow metaphors from people who survived us. And then we wonder why our memories feel foreign. You don't have to keep those words. You can return them. You can say, that phrase never fit me. That sentence was too heavy. That wasn't sit my story. That was someone else sip's projection. And then, you can dream again. But this time, on your own terms. Let the language soften. Let it loosen. Let it float. Because not every memory needs a fixed name. Some things happened, and unsuch need to be narrated. Some feelings existed, but defy description. That sip's okay. Silence can remember too. Not as absence, but as space. For breath. For possibility. For words you haven't invented yet. Now breathe. Think of a phrase you always use to describe your childhood, or your last relationship, or the moment everything changed. Feel it in your mouth. Taste the edges of it. Now ask yourself, is that the only phrase that fits? Is there a new sentence that leaves room for growth? A sentence with softness. A sentence with ambiguity. A sentence with healing. Try it. Let your tongue shape something kinder. Let your voice rewrite the echo. Let the dream reshape the memory. Because language dreams memory. And you are the dreamer. You are allowed to wake up with a new story. You remember what never happened. Not because you lied, but because you needed it to make sense. And so the story appeared. Cleaner than reality. Smoother than chaos. It isn't set fabrication. It's just confabulation. Your brain, desperate for coherence, filled in the blanks, and language did the rest. You don't remember the moment you first felt abandoned. You remember the sentence that explained it. You don't recall every detail of the argument. You remember the version that made you the villain, or the victim. And over time, that version hardened. It stopped being a story. It became fact. But it wasn't it. It was a false past, narrated into existence. By repetition. This is how memory works. It tells itself a story. And the more often that story is told, the truer it feels. Even if it sets wrong, especially if it sits wrong. Because the brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy, and language offers coherence. So your past isn't set to museum, it's set to theater. The costumes change, the lines get rehearsed, the lighting shifts to highlight what hurts. And you, the narrator, believe the script. I said always been too much. I ruin good things. No one ever stayed. These aren't set memories. They sit as conclusions. Sentences written long after the fact, to make the ache feel organized. But they become memory, because memory doesn't care about what really happened. It cares about what sips sayable, and what sips sayable becomes replayable. The false past is not the opposite of truth. It is a truth you needed, before you had better words. You didn't invent it maliciously, you built it carefully, to survive. You chose the version that made the pain seem explainable, the one that helped you sleep, or made you strong, or kept you small enough to be safe. But now, you're still reciting it out of habit, and every time you say it, it deepens. Every retelling adds another layer of emotional proof. You cry, and the story feels more true. You flinch, and the memory becomes more vivid. You avoid, and the pattern becomes more permanent. But what if it didn't happen that way? What if your memory isn't a photo, but a painting? What if the colors changed each time you described it? What if the version of the past you been living in was an echo of someone else's story, and you just inherited it? You don't need to disprove the memory. You need to question the narration. Ask, is this story serving me, or sentencing me? Does this version of the past make me feel more whole, or more trapped? Because sometimes healing isn't finding a better memory. It's finding a better narrator. One who doesn't villainize you, or for coping the only way you knew how. One who doesn't mistake survival for failure. One who sees you not as broken, but as misquoted. Now, breathe. Think of a story you always tell, about your past. The one that defines you, that explains everything. Pause it. Interrupt the monologue. Rewrite the tone. What if you weren't the one who was wrong? What if you were just the one who had no language for what was happening? You don't need to change the events. You just need to change the angle. You are allowed to retell the moment without the shame. You are allowed to admit that you filled in some blanks. You are allowed to unwrite a sentence that never really belonged to you. Because the false past only holds power if you keep reciting it, and silence can sometimes be more truthful than repetition. Now rest. Let the old story sleep. Let the narrator soften. Let the false past dissolve into unspoken possibility. You are not the story you told yourself to survive. You are the one who sits finally ready to tell a new one. You think you have memories because you have a mind, but maybe it sits the other way around. Maybe you have a mind because you have memories. Strange, isn't it? To consider that everything you call you might not be a person, but a pattern, a web of stored experiences, arranged just so, given names, and called identity. You don't have a self separate from memory. You are memory, looping itself into awareness, not as a collection, but as a continuity. Your first smile, your first punishment, the voice that called your name kindly, the one that didn't set. Each moment, stored, shaped, softened, or sharpened, became the narrative thread that tied you together. There is no mind without memory. Not because the mind uses it, because the mind is it. Studies on amnesia prove it. When memory collapses, so does identity. People forget not just events, but preferences, beliefs, habits, even language. The scaffolding of the self falls away when memory disappears. So the mind is not a thing. It sets an ongoing construction, and memory is the builder. Every time you recall something, your brain reweaves that thread, sometimes tighter, sometimes with a different color, sometimes completely wrong, but always, it becomes real. This is what neuroscience calls reconsolidation. Each memory you access is rebuilt from scratch, not accessed like a file, rewritten like a sentence, on a whiteboard that never quite dries. And yet, you build your mind from it. You say, I am the kind of person who, but that sip's just a memory, refreshed enough times, and to become belief. You say, I don't do well with conflict, because 5 or 10 arguments ago, you felt something that stuck, and now that moment, that sensation, has authored your identity. So who would you be without the memory? Not empty, but open, unformed, unfixed, undefined. You wouldn't be lost. You just be unnarrated, a consciousness without furniture, a mirror without a label. But the moment you remember, even incorrectly, the self rushes back in. Memory invents the mind, and the mind defends its invention. With such fervor, you rarely question it. You believe the same thought, again and again, and call it a trait. You replay the same pain, and call it insight. You repeat the same fear, and call it intuition. But maybe, just maybe, you've to not discovering yourself. You stir reciting yourself, and you forgot you were the one who learned the lines. Now ask, what part of your mind feels permanent? What thought keeps insisting on its own truth? I still not good enough. I can trust anyone. I still always be alone. These don't live in some soul-shaped vault. They live in your memory, and they are editable. Because memory is malleable, and the mind is modular, and identity is a looping reconstruction you can gently reweave, not by force, not by pretending, but by seeing clearly how much of who you are is who you remember being, and how often that memory was shaped by someone else's sentence. You were told, you stir so sensitive, you stir selfish, you steer lazy, and those words stuck, not just in your brain, but in your mind. They shaped the internal narrator. They became your tone, your posture, your prediction. And over time, you stopped noticing that it was a story. You called it truth, but it was always memory, disguised as fact. So who are you without the invention? Who are you without the remembered pattern, replaying its lines? You stir not blank. You stir just unassigned, ready for a new structure, ready to speak a new tone, ready to remember forward. Because that sips the final twist. You stir not just remembering the past. You stir premembering the future. The mind that holds your memories also predicts what comes next. And if you change the pattern, you change the expectation. If you remember peace, you predict safety. If you remember love, you predict trust. If you remember truth, not as certainty, but as curiosity, you create a mind that doesn't cling. So now, try it. Choose a memory. A painful one. A defining one. Don't erase it. Just see how it shaped you. Then ask, what part of this became my mind? What story? What conclusion? What rule? And can I soften it? Can I reimagine what I became from it? You don't have to forget. You only have to remember differently. Because memory isn't set inside the mind. Memory is the mind. And you are allowed to reinvent it. Before the first word, there was silence. Not absence, but potential. A space that held everything, because it had not yet chosen anything. And then, the mouth opened. The child named the world. Mama, light, hurt, me. Memory began. Not as film, but as language. Not as reality, but as description. From that first word, the mind began to build. It stacked stories into identity. It turned repetition into self. It mistook fluency for truth. And now here you are, entangled in your own narration, wondering which part is you, and which part is just the echo of an echo. But if you listen closely, you can hear something beneath the story. Still there, still quiet, still whole. Silence. The silence that came before, and still comes after. You filled your mind with words, with labels, with moments named so many times, they feel immovable. But the brain that built them was always guessing. It chose structure over chaos. It stitched stories over noise. You said, "I am this kind of person. I always do that. I never get what I want." And those sentences became real, not because they were true, but because they were said. Language made them sticky. Memory made them solid. The mind, desperate for continuity, let them calcify. But underneath it all, the silence remained. Its stumps not erasure. Its depths origin. The part of you that never needed to be understood, or defended, or narrated. The part of you that does not speak in sentences. That does not split the world into subject and object. That does not ask for permission to simply be. This is the paradox. Language built your mind, but language cannot hold you. Memory built yourself, but memory cannot free you. Only silence can do that. The kind of silence that sips not the absence of words, but the presence of space. You touch it every time you breathe without performing. Every time you sit with pain, without narrating it into reason. You taste it when you forget the script for a second and just watch the wind move without needing a metaphor. You feel it when you stop trying to organize your memories into meaning. There is freedom there, not in explaining who you are, but in releasing the need to explain at all. And, in that release, memory softens. The loops stop rehearsing. The narrator forgets its lines, and the silence returns. Not to erase the story, but to hold it gently. To say, "You were never the words. You were the space between them. Now rest. Let the words fade. Let the timeline blur. You don't need to remember how it started, or how it ends. The silence remembers, and the silence forgives. And in that quiet, a deeper truth waits, that you are not the mind. You are not even the memory. You are the presence, before and after both. You are the page, not the sentence. You are the pause, not the voice. You are the one who listens as the silence returns to write itself into you, again, and again, and again, and now you are here. At the edge of the thought that began 30 stories ago. You do not remember them all. You are not meant to. Memory is not a bookshelf. It is a wind that rearranges pages. Each time you turn to look, what you remember is not the truth of what you heard, but the rhythm in which it echoed. You began with a question. Is memory real? Or is it an illusion, spoken into being by a language that came too late to witness the truth? And now, you no longer need an answer, because something deeper has stirred. Not knowledge, but silence. Not conclusion, but space. Every section brought you closer to the shape of forgetting, and not the kind that means loss, but the kind that means liberation. You are not here to prove a theory. You are here to dissolve one. You have seen how memory lies, not out of malice, but out of necessity. How it fills in gaps, invents emotions, borrows words from strangers, and calls them autobiography. You still watched yourself remember what never happened, forget what did, and rebuild the ruins with prettier grammar. Not because you stood broken, because you are human, and humans don't sit remember. They narrate, they revise, they rehearse, they re-feel what was once a fleeting sensation, until it becomes a lifelong belief. You told yourself you were the problem, because the sentence fit the mood, and mood becomes memory when repeated enough. You remembered the trauma with clarity, but the joy that came before it, gone, because no one gave you the words to hold it. You still lived inside stories. You didn't step right. You sit memorized guilt, like a song in a language you never fully understood. And now, the silence has returned. The kind that remembers everything, but speaks nothing. The kind that sees all your versions, all your edits, all your misremembered selves, and forgives them. You are not the memory. You are not even the mind that believes in memory. You are the space before both. You are the one who watched it all unfold, From the first word to the last forgetting, you are the pause between the sentence and the breath. And in that pause, there is no shame, no timeline, no identity written in stone, just possibility. The truth is not in what you remember. The truth is in how gently you start willing to let go of remembering. The past does not exist, except in your retelling of it. And tonight, as you drift into sleep, you may forget this entire script. You may not recall. Words remember you, or syntax becomes memory, or verbs become real. You may not recall the thought experiments, the metaphors, the recursive spirals of logic, but something will remain. Not a word, not a lesson, a feeling, a softness, the loosening of a belief you didn't know you were gripping, the slight uncoiling of identity from the story it wrapped around. And in that loosening, there is peace, because memory, even when it lies, was never meant to imprison you. It was meant to help you survive, to keep the thread going, to turn chaos into coherence, even if it meant bending the facts. You do not need to hate your memory. You do not need to silence it. You only need to know that it is not you. It is a storyteller, not a judge, a function, not a truth. And now, as sleep approaches, the storyteller quiets. The voice that Sip's been naming, and labeling, and editing, and reliving, it finally slows. Because it knows you are safe enough to not remember. You are safe enough to be here, just here, without a past to prove, or a self to defend. So let it go. Let the narrative unravel. Let the words grow soft and float backward into the silence that was always there. You will forget this story, but you will remember how it felt to stop being the narrator, to stop being the story, to just be the page. And the page, unwritten, unafraid, unfixed, is free. Now sleep, not as the one who remembers, but as the one who no longer needs to. The silence is here. It was always here. It is you.